You think you know the story of World War II's final days, but prepare to uncover the shocking, little-known secrets of the Luftwaffe's dying gasp. By the spring of 1945, Germany's Air Force, once the pride of a nation and feared across the globe, had been reduced to fragments. What remained of its pilots, machines, and strategies was pushed to the absolute limit. Allied aircraft dominated the skies, bombing factories, railways, and cities with relentless precision. German airfields were left in ruins, fuel was scarce, and maintenance crews struggled desperately to keep anything airborne. Yet, in the midst of this chaos, the German high command demanded action, desperate, seemingly suicidal action that defied logic and reason. Pilots who survived to this point faced a grim reality. Every mission could be their last. The Luftwaffe's once powerful squadrons were fragmented, flying aircraft that were aging, damaged, or utterly unfit for modern air combat. Engineers scavenged wreckage, salvaging engines, wings, and instruments to piece together barely functional fighters and bombers. Yet, despite these extreme limitations, new experimental weapons were being rushed into the air, often with catastrophic consequences. Some of these wonder weapons promised technological miracles. Jet fighters that could outrun anything the Allies possessed, rocket-powered aircraft capable of astonishing speed, and unmanned flying bombs intended to destroy distant targets were all deployed in these final desperate months. In theory, these innovations could have turned the tide, but in practice, many failed catastrophically, exploding on launch, malfunctioning mid-air, or being impossible to control. Beyond experimental aircraft, there were tactics that seemed more like acts of sheer madness than strategy. Pilots were trained for ramming attacks, known as ram commando, where they would deliberately collide with enemy bombers. Modern military doctrine would never justify such actions, yet in the Luftwaffe's final days, it became a grim necessity. Young men, barely out of their teens, climbed into aircraft with barely enough fuel for a single pass, fully aware that their mission might end in certain death. Every sortie carried the weight of desperation, of a force clinging to honor and duty when survival was almost impossible. The human element of this story is as shocking as the tactics themselves. Experienced pilots who had survived hundreds of missions now faced orders that contradicted everything they had learned about survival and strategy. Letters sent home speak of quiet despair, farewell messages written in case they did not return. Commanders wrestled with their own consciences, issuing directives that were at once insane and, in their view, necessary. Pride, fear, and illusion guided their actions as they attempted to delay the inevitable, to make a stand even when the war had already been lost. In the midst of this chaos, the Allies remained mostly unaware of the scale of the Luftwaffe's desperation. Fragmented squadrons, improvised aircraft, and pilots flying out of sheer courage or compulsion confronted entire formations of Allied bombers and fighters. Each mission was a high-stakes gamble, with death as the only guaranteed outcome. Survival depended not only on skill but also on luck, timing, and the ability to push a machine beyond its mechanical limits. The skies over Germany became a theater of courage, fear, and tragic determination. Factories and research labs worked around the clock. Engineers pushed the boundaries of technology to create weapons that could, in theory, reverse the course of defeat. Jet-powered aircraft, rocket planes, and experimental bombs were all part of this last-ditch effort. Pilots were trained to fly machines that were sometimes more dangerous than the enemy. Testing, often rushed and incomplete, turned hope into horror, as many pilots perished not from combat, but from the failure of their own weapons. The line between bravery and fatal miscalculation blurred completely. Amid overwhelming odds, some pilots refused to surrender or hide. Driven by pride, indoctrination, and sheer willpower, they took off repeatedly, sometimes alone, sometimes in small formations, attacking Allied forces with whatever they had at hand. Each mission tested skill, courage, and endurance, while simultaneously flirting with tragedy. The losses were catastrophic, yet the pilots who survived carried forward, often haunted by the deaths of their comrades and the knowledge that their efforts could not change the inevitable outcome. By the war's final months, the Luftwaffe's operations had shifted from organized strategy to improvisation and sheer desperation. Pilots improvised routes, flew unconventional formations, and tried experimental techniques to survive or slow the Allied advance. Ground crews fabricated parts from scrap and improvised solutions wherever possible. Fuel shortages forced pilots to fly with minimum reserves, often taking off without knowing whether they could return. The entire operation became a testament to human ingenuity under extreme pressure, yet it was doomed from the start. Even in such extreme desperation, a strange, haunting bravery emerged. Men flew rickety, poorly maintained planes against impossible odds, risking everything for a cause that had already become hopeless. Each flight was an act of courage and tragedy, revealing not only the horror of a collapsing military, but also the extraordinary human capacity to confront despair. The Luftwaffe's final days were not about victory. They were about endurance, making a last stand, clinging to honor, and facing death with resolve. As the spring of 1945 deepened, the skies over Germany were a theater of chaos and desperation. The once mighty Luftwaffe, now a shadow of its former self, scrambled to mount defenses against overwhelming Allied forces. Pilots, engineers, and commanders alike faced a grim reality. The war was lost, yet surrender was not yet an option. Every sortie, every experimental launch, every ramming attack was a calculated step into near-certain death, yet these men persisted. They were not merely fighting for victory anymore. They were fighting for honor, for duty, and, in some sense, for the fragments of a military identity that had defined them for years. Secret missions became the norm. Intelligence and reconnaissance operations that had once been routine now bordered on the impossible. Small, improvised squadrons took off in rickety aircraft, often guided by limited radar and outdated maps, attempting to strike at Allied positions or gather information critical to the Reich's last-minute strategies. Many of these missions never returned. Some were intercepted by overwhelming Allied fighter formations. Others were lost due to mechanical failure, running out of fuel, or miscalculations that proved fatal. Yet, despite the losses, pilots continued to fly. There was a strange determination in these acts, a mixture of training, indoctrination, desperation, and sheer human resilience. Experimental aircraft played a central role in these final gambits. The Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, became both a symbol of hope and of the Luftwaffe's desperation. Pilots praised its speed and agility, yet the jet was plagued by engine failures, fuel shortages, and maintenance difficulties that often grounded missions before they could begin. Engineers worked tirelessly, improvising solutions and modifying parts scavenged from wrecks, racing against time to keep these advanced machines airworthy. Alongside the Me-262 were rocket-powered fighters and unmanned flying bombs, innovations that could theoretically shift the balance, but in practice were as likely to destroy the pilot as the enemy. The human cost of testing these machines was staggering, yet the Luftwaffe embraced risk as necessity because there was no other option left. The concept of ramming, or ram commando, escalated to terrifying heights. Pilots were instructed to deliberately collide with enemy bombers if ammunition ran out or if fuel would not allow a return. These missions demanded perfect precision, unshakable nerves, and, ultimately, a willingness to die for a mission that could not succeed strategically. Testimonies from surviving pilots describe a surreal mix of fear and adrenaline, as they climbed into planes knowing that the next few minutes could be their last. In some cases, ramming attacks destroyed multiple enemy aircraft, yet the cost was invariably the life of the pilot. Such tactics underlined the extreme psychological and operational pressure that defined the Luftwaffe's final months. The human drama extended beyond the cockpit. Ground crews labored under constant threat of air raids, often working in bombed-out hangars or open fields, repairing and refueling aircraft under fire. Engineers experimented with untested technologies, modifying jets, cannons, and bombs in ways that blurred the line between brilliance and madness. Morale was fragile, yet duty and indoctrination kept these men working tirelessly. Letters, diaries, and post-war testimonies reveal a pervasive sense of tension, fear, and grim determination. Every action was shadowed by the knowledge that survival was uncertain, yet inaction was impossible. Pilots were often sent on missions with minimal briefing, forced to rely on instinct, experience, and luck. They encountered formations of Allied bombers and fighters that outnumbered them many times over. Every sortie was a test of courage, skill, and improvisation. Young men who had trained for years in ideal conditions now faced extreme adversity, damaged aircraft, unreliable engines, and near-impossible odds. Yet some flew repeatedly, driven by honor, pride, and the memory of comrades lost in earlier missions. Their bravery was haunting, almost otherworldly, because it existed in a landscape where logic had failed and strategy had given way to desperation. Even as the Luftwaffe's infrastructure crumbled, some units attempted organized resistance. Fighter wings coordinated attacks, using terrain, weather, and surprise to their advantage whenever possible. Pilots learned to adapt rapidly, forming ad hoc tactics to offset overwhelming numerical inferiority. Yet no matter the planning, every mission carried extreme risk. The human cost of this resistance was staggering, yet it demonstrated the extraordinary resilience of men who refused to surrender even as defeat loomed. The final weeks of the war saw a mixture of innovation and futility. Jet fighters streaked across the skies, rocket planes roared in sudden bursts of speed, and unmanned bombs were launched towards cities and supply lines. Many missions failed spectacularly, yet the intent, the planning, and the human determination were remarkable. Pilots, engineers, and commanders alike became part of a desperate, tragic narrative, a last stand that was both heroic and inevitable in its futility. The scale of desperation, innovation, and human courage in these months is difficult to overstate. It was a collapse driven by strategy, ideology, and the raw will to resist until the very end. Witness accounts describe surreal aerial battles, small, ragged formations of German jets darting among massive Allied fleets, ramming attacks that destroyed entire squadrons, jets and rockets that vanished in explosions seconds after takeoff. On the ground, technicians and engineers worked feverishly, improvising replacements and repairs, all under the shadow of constant bombardment. Every sortie, every experimental launch, every desperate maneuver was a gamble where the odds were stacked almost entirely against the Luftwaffe. Yet the human will to act, to resist, to make one final stand, persisted in a manner that was both awe-inspiring and horrifying. The last days of the Luftwaffe were defined by contradictions, innovation and chaos, bravery and tragedy, desperation and determination. The pilots who survived these final missions carried the scars of both body and mind, while those who fell became part of a story that revealed the extremes of human courage in the face of inevitable defeat. There was no glory, only endurance, no victory, only the attempt to cling to honor as the world collapsed around them. In this final chapter, we see not just the end of a military force, but the essence of human resilience and tragedy. The Luftwaffe's last stand was a combination of extraordinary technological ambition, extreme tactical risk, and profound human courage, a story rarely told in its full scale. These months revealed the lengths to which men and machines would go in an attempt to hold back the inevitable, a desperate gamble that was doomed but magnificent in its sheer audacity. By late April and early May of 1945, the Luftwaffe's situation had become utterly desperate. The skies over Germany were filled with Allied bombers and fighters, dominating every sector with unchallenged air superiority. Fuel, pilots, and functioning aircraft were scarce, and yet the German High Command continued to issue orders for sorties that were, in essence, suicidal. The pilots who remained were no longer just warriors. They were men confronting inevitability, tasked with acts of courage that bordered on the impossible. Each mission was a mixture of hope and despair, a final statement of endurance in the face of complete collapse. The experimental aircraft that had promised to change the course of the war were now largely failures. Jet fighters sputtered out of control, rocket planes exploded prematurely, and unmanned flying bombs often malfunctioned or were intercepted before reaching their targets. Yet, even amid these failures, pilots continued to fly, sometimes improvising tactics midair, sometimes taking off with the mere hope that they might survive long enough to make a difference. The line between heroism and tragedy blurred completely. Every takeoff carried the weight of a war lost, but not yet surrendered, every maneuver a dance with death itself. Ramming attacks, once rare, became increasingly common. Pilots trained to intercept bombers with their own aircraft, fully aware that this would almost certainly be their last flight. These acts were not random. They were desperate attempts to inflict damage and slow the inevitable advance of the Allies. Survivors recount scenes of unimaginable chaos, fighter pilots weaving through flak, evading enemy gunners, diving into formations with no hope of returning. For the few who survived, the experience left permanent scars, both physical and psychological. Ground crews worked around the clock under constant bombardment. Fuel shortages forced creative improvisation. Engines were patched with whatever materials could be found, and bombs were sometimes improvised using untested explosives. Every day, men labored under the threat of death, repairing, refueling, and launching missions that had no strategic chance of success. The human resilience on display was staggering, yet the futility was undeniable. Each sortie risked not just the aircraft, but the lives of the pilots and crew, and every day brought a new wave of casualties. Despite the chaos, small pockets of organized resistance emerged. Pilots coordinated daring strikes against advancing Allied columns, often under impossible odds. These missions were characterized by ingenuity and bravery, yet they could not alter the outcome. Each action was a testament to the pilot's skill, courage, and unwavering commitment to duty, even as the Reich crumbled around them. In the skies, the Luftwaffe's remnants fought fiercely, but numerically and technologically, they were overwhelmed. Every engagement ended with loss, yet each sortie became a story of determination against despair. As Berlin fell and the Reich collapsed, the Luftwaffe's remaining aircraft were grounded, captured, or destroyed. Pilots either surrendered, were killed in combat, or continued to fly missions with no realistic chance of success. The human cost of these final days was immense. Families received letters written in the shadow of certain death. Pilots left diaries describing missions they knew could only end in tragedy, and entire squadrons vanished with almost no record of their final actions. The end of the Luftwaffe was not marked by a single battle, but by a cascade of losses, exhaustion, and the quiet surrender of a once mighty force. In retrospect, the final months of the Luftwaffe reveal a story of extreme desperation, ingenuity, and profound human courage. Men flew experimental jets and rickety planes, executed ramming attacks, and faced impossible odds with unwavering resolve. They acted not for glory, not for victory, but for duty, honor, and the fleeting hope of survival. The collapse of the Luftwaffe was both tragic and awe-inspiring, a final demonstration of human determination in the face of overwhelming despair. The story of the Luftwaffe's last stand is more than a military history. It is a story of human endurance under unimaginable pressure. It is a tale of pilots who flew knowing death was likely, engineers who worked in constant danger, and commanders who made impossible decisions in a collapsing war machine. Their courage, their failures, and their tragedies stand as a haunting reminder of the extremes of war. The Luftwaffe's final days were not about changing history. They were about confronting inevitability with bravery, making a last stand even when all hope was lost, and facing the end with unwavering resolve. And so, the Luftwaffe faded into history, leaving behind stories of desperation, innovation, and human endurance that continue to astonish and inspire. Their legacy is not one of victory, but of the extraordinary lengths humans will go to in the face of impossible odds. In the end, the men who flew in those final missions embodied a haunting combination of courage, tragedy, and the relentless human spirit, a spirit that, even in defeat, refused to surrender entirely.